the corpus Dionysiacum. The Dionysian corpus is how I like to put it, but if we're going to be pigs on the Latin, then that's what we do there. I don't know, about a month and a half ago, well, 2 months ago when we were on the last trip, right toward the end, because I was sitting here, I read to you from Pseudo-Dionysius. I read an entire book, it's the shortest book, on the mystical theology. And most of the comments were, huh? And I think that many people just go, why should I know anything about this? Well, if I were to say, why should you know anything about Athanasius? What would you say? Most people recognize that Athanasius was vitally important in the defense of the deity of Christ during the period of time between the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople. We certainly have explained that Arianism became predominant during that time, and the majority of the external church adopted a compromised position in regards to the deity of Christ, with the exception of Athanasius. So, Athanasius against the world, Athanasius contra mundum, okay, probably a lot of the people in our audience know that, but how many people in evangelicalism as a whole could even put Athanasius in the right century, let alone identify the topic that one of the topics he's important for? A very small percentage. So when you talk about Pseudo-Dionysius, vast majority, 98.9% minimally, of graduates from Southern Baptist seminaries and evangelical seminaries and Bible seminaries and so on and so forth, if they've even heard of him, and even heard of the books, don't have any earthly idea what they're about, and less knowledge of how that's relevant to almost anything. So why in the world should you care on a Saturday afternoon? As we'll see, I have a slide that will talk about the impact. Many of the things in the more ancient church, and this is, I would date the writing of this corpus of materials around the year 500. As I've mentioned, I just finished an article refuting, from my perspective, the claims of Craig Trulia and another individual published in 2024, claiming that Pseudo-Dionysius isn't pseudo, that this is the writings of Dionysius, the convert of Paul, in Acts 17:34. And it comes from the first century, and therefore it's radically important because this is like the closest Christian writing to the New Testament that we possess, which would overthrow all of church history as it stands today. That perspective, however, had existed for 1,000 years. Thomas Aquinas quotes from Dionysius, the third most of anyone. Only Aristotle and Augustine more often. I went with the small number for him of 500 citations, but I've seen as much as 1,700 citations of Dionysius. And of course, that gets into is he referring and stuff like that. That's why the numbers are different. But anyway, for 1,000 years, people both in the East and West believed that Dionysius, that these writings came from Paul's convert. What else do you have like that in church history? When you think of the Didache, when you think of Ignatius, any of what are called the Apostolic Fathers, they're still long after that time period. This would be the earliest writing outside of the New Testament that we would possess. And it's incredibly complicated. It's soaked in Greek philosophy. It has an incredibly complicated and developed ecclesiology. It would change everything. And that is why there is almost nobody who takes the position that Craig Trillia does on this subject. But that doesn't make him wrong. It just means that that's a really unusual position to take. And so, all of that to say, you can engage with Eastern Orthodoxy without spending a great deal of time on Dionysius. You do need to recognize that Dionysius is exceptionally important in the development of modern Orthodox theology, but it's not the central issue. It is a very important issue. So we know who Dionysius the Areopagite was. Acts 17:34, Paul preaches in the Areopagus in Athens among his converts. Dionysius the Areopagite, a member of the elite court of the Areopagus, the ancient Athenian council. This is the identity claimed by the author of the corpus. So if this was written in 500 AD, then this is it's a forgery on the technical side. But it was certainly not unheard of in the ancient world. There's all sorts of pseudo-Ignatian epistles and pseudo-Athanasius, and these forgeries have been a really important part of church history. Really, really important part of church history. In 1895, Cook and Stiglmaier independently demonstrated the language of the corpus belongs to the same era and school as the 5th century Neoplatonism of Proclus, not the 1st century AD. The author is therefore called Pseudo-Dionysius, a deliberately chosen pseudonym, the identity behind which remains contested to this day. That is certainly the consensus scholarly view of Catholics, Protestants, agnostics, atheists, Buddhists. I don't know if there are any Buddhist scholars of ancient church history. Might be. But that is the vast majority perspective. But, as I said, there are those who are promoting a different perspective, and that's why I wrote the article that I did. The world that produced the corpus, late 5th, early 6th century, scholarly consensus dates the corpus to 470-530 AD. So 500 is a nice round number, right in the middle there. The age of Proclus, 412 to 45, the last great Neoplatonist, and of the Christological controversies following Chalcedon. So, you know, we often think of the Christological stuff that prompted the Council of Chalcedon, hypostatic union, issues related to that. So, you know, once the assertion of Christ as being homoousios is finally defended and established, and that does not just happen at Nicaea. Nicaea is overturned by Ariminum, Sirmium, but it's then rehabilitated and reestablished at Constantinople in 381. So after that, now further questions are being asked. So, okay, if Christ is consubstantial with the Father, then what about the incarnation? What is the nature of the incarnation? What's the relationship of the divine and human in Christ? All these questions start popping up with a number of different responses. And so you have controversy that comes from that. The corpus stands at the intersection of three streams: Alexandrian Jewish wisdom tradition, Philo, the wisdom of Solomon; Alexandrian Christian theology, Clement and Origen; and late Athenian Neoplatonism. Now you can see why that means that not everybody is overly excited about reading this material, since the majority of us have not read any of that. And the majority of us majority of evangelicals would struggle to know which Clement's even being discussed there, and have probably heard only negative things about Origen, which is really easy to do because his theology was a royal mess, but he was the most prolific author in the ancient world. He had scribes following him around 24 hours a day, just writing down everything he said. You get a lot of books written that way. But, late Athenian Neoplatonism. That's something I talk about every morning. Oh, no, it's not really. The pseudonymous strategy, by writing as a first-century convert of Paul, the author gave his speculative theology apostolic authority. The fiction was widely accepted until the Renaissance and is still defended by some Orthodox scholars. So think about it. From the middle of the 6th century until the Renaissance, it is just generally accepted. That would be Thomas Aquinas. That would be the immediate predecessors of the Reformers themselves. All believed that this writing was fundamentally the earliest Christian writing outside of the New Testament that we possess. So think about how important, for example, the Didache is as an early extra-biblical writing to give us an insight into what the early church was like. Okay, now throw this in. Now, this was pre-critical thinking. This was during a time period where anachronism was not recognized the way that it's recognized today. And that's why this issue even exists. We've talked about anachronism before. I've given an illustration. Why is it that you can look at medieval paintings of David and he looks like he's a knight living in a castle? Because of anachronism. People did not understand the progress of time, in the sense that they thought that since in their experience, their great-great-great-great-great-grandparents had lived in the same world that they lived in, pretty much same level of knowledge, same cultural situation, that it had always been that way. So if David was a king, then David lived in the castle and rode a horse and had knights with armor and so on and so forth. That's not the way it was, but that's how people thought. That's what they experienced. And when most people during the medieval period never traveled more than 7 miles in one direction from where they were born, you can see how you could get the idea that the world's pretty much the same everywhere, when, of course, it's not. The corpus surfaces definitively at the Council of Constantinople in 532, cited by the Monophysites. Both Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians quickly claimed it, indicating its content was theologically versatile. In other words, it could be used and interpreted in a wide variety of fashions, and therefore it could be useful to both sides at the same time. A lot of political documents are that way too. The earliest witness of the corpus is not Greek. It's a Syriac translation by Sergius of Rashaina, who died in 536, preserved in certain Syriac or Sinai manuscript here. This predates all surviving Greek manuscripts by centuries. So if it's written between 570 and 530, we get Sergius in 530s, and then really important, John of Scythopolis, the prologue in Scholia, creates the Editio Variorum archetype for all Greek manuscripts after that. Then in 708, the second Syriac translation, Focus Bar Sergius, and then 9th century, the earliest surviving Greek manuscripts come to date. So, yeah, are there textual critical issues? Yeah, there are. And there is a critical edition of Dionysius. It's not cheap. I did obtain it for purposes of the article and other things. Does that have major impact? No, not really. It's not vitally important. It's interesting, but not vitally important. So what's in it? I think I showed this once before. You have 4 major books. Now, when I call the Mystical Theology a major book, it's a standalone book, but I read it. I read the entirety of it to you on the program, so it's not that, it's very short. It's only 5 chapters. But it is the summit of the work. So you have 4 books and then 10 letters. So the books are called the Divine Names. The first one is called the Divine Names. And it's interesting, by the way. When Dionysius appears in history, it appears as a body of documents. It doesn't start off where the Divine Names appears first in one area, and then the Celestial Hierarchy in another area. No, it boom. Starting about 530, it's just there, fully developed, all the language there, all the books, all the letters, everything's there, which definitely suggests that it was produced in that form to begin with. So the first book, the Divine Names, interprets the biblical names of God: good, being, life, light, beauty, love, wisdom. It is the longest and most philosophically dense book in the corpus. Then you have the Celestial Hierarchy. Hierarchy is probably the key term in Dionysius. The fact that Eastern Orthodox theology and ecclesiology is very much hierarchical is directly related to that. The exposition of the 9 orders of angels as described in Scripture. It establishes the theory of hierarchy and symbolic interpretation. So, hierarchy, there are certain aspects to it. Certain things only flow downward, certain other things only flow upward, and this ends up being applied to all sorts of aspects of Christian theology. The Ecclesiastical Hierarchy interprets the rites and orders of the church: baptism, Eucharist, chrismation, monastic rite, the earthly image of the celestial. So what you really need to know there is the viewpoint of the church that is presented is highly complex. For the vast majority of Christian scholarship, again, outside of Orthodoxy, so even Roman Catholic scholarship would say that the complexity of the ecclesiastical system found in Dionysius did not exist in the 1st century or the 2nd century or the 3rd century. It developed long afterwards. So, chrismation, the monastic rites, this is stuff that everybody else believes developed over time. But if you accept Dionysius as 1st century, it's apostolic. It was there from the beginning. Now you have to explain why nobody else knew that. There's the real problem. Accepting the Nicotopoulos Trulia theory, which is what my paper was about, which we'll talk about later, not today, obviously, don't worry. Accepting that theory creates mountains of anachronism. Why didn't Ignatius know about this? Why didn't the Didache know about this? Why didn't everybody you can start talking about didn't know any of this stuff? Dionysius did. Evidently, Paul taught it, and then everybody forgot it for a very, 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 very long time. The questions that the theory produces are massive. They truly are. The mystical theology I read to you a number of weeks ago, shortest work, only 5 chapters. The summit of the corpus, apophatic theology carried to silence and union beyond all knowing. So Apophasis is denial in Greek. So it's sometimes called negative theology, where instead of saying anything positive about God, you describe God negatively by saying what he isn't, not what he is. The fundamental idea is that our language is too weak to positively tell us what God is, but it's sufficient to tell us what God isn't. And it is generally viewed as more respectful, but also more mystical. Because once you emphasize negation, that really opens up the door for mystical experience to fill in. It's more amenable to mysticism than positive theology, cataphatic theology, positive statement theology, which is what we in the West are accustomed to. Because it leaves all those doors open for all sorts of interesting speculation. And once Dionysius became known in the West, and especially was cited over and over again by Thomas Aquinas, it became central to the development of Western mysticism. And so when you read the Western mystics, they are soaked in Dionysius. And because they believe Dionysius was convert to Paul. Then the epistles, the 10 letters, addressed to name recipients of ascending hierarchical rank, all the way up to John the Apostle. They treat specific theological questions. The sequence itself mirrors the hierarchy. There is a very possible reference to the Dormition of Mary in that. Again, something that started becoming popular around 500, so it would fit there, but it would be wildly out of place in the first century or early second century. I find the epistles to be the most non-genuine sounding. In other words, it's sort of forced to try to make it sound that these were really epistles written to these people. Because again, one thing you have to recognize, there is no reference to any of this for 500 years. And if these were real epistles sent to multiple different places, again, and when we do see them, they just, boom, appear, poof, as a body in history. No development. You don't have one of these 10 letters being quoted in the year 350 and then the other 10 letters get discovered in 450, which would make more sense. They all just, boom, are there. Because this body was produced as one body of literature. And it appears as a body of literature, including the letters which are sent to different people. Real quickly, the intellectual background, Neoplatonism, the late ancient philosophical tradition running from Plotinus, 205 to 270, through Iamblichus and Proclus, 412 to 45, provides the metaphysical architecture that Pseudo-Dionysius both employs and transforms. So he's not just repeating Neoplatonism, he's Christianizing it, which I think was one of the encouragements for Thomas to Christianize Aristotle as well. See, if convert Paul could do it, then I can do the same thing. So what are some of these key issues? Well, the one, ta hen. The ultimate reality transcends all predication, even being. It is beyond thought and speech, the source from which all proceeds and to which all returns. Dionysius maps this onto the God of Scripture, describing God as super essential, hyperousios, very important term in Dionysian theology. The procession and return, proados, and the epistrophe, all reality flows outward from the one into a multiplicity. That's procession. So you've got one, and then it multiplies into multiplicity. Then returns to its source, reversion. So Proclus, every effect remains in its cause, proceeds from it, and reverts upon it. Dionysius Christianizes this as divine self-giving love and the soul's uplifting to God. So there is a serious attempt on Dionysius' part to Christianize and to use scriptural language. Just because you don't think that this is a convert of Paul doesn't mean that you can't be fair to it and recognize that there is clearly an attempt being made by Dionysius to at least make this perspective consonant with scriptural language. But realize that started early on. You see that in Justin Martyr in the 150s. So the Greek thinking, philosophically oriented Christians from the start seek to Christianize Greek philosophy. And the big question is just how far can you go with that? Can you do that? What does it look like? That's the issue there. The hierarchy, really, really important here. Reality is stratified in descending grades of being, each reflecting the higher. Dionysius transforms this into a theological concept, a sacred order, knowledge, and activity whose goal is assimilation to God and union with Him. The Celestial Hierarchy 3.1 puts it that way. So everything is hierarchical. There is the proper flow. This becomes very important in the form of the church, everything. Theurgy, in Iamblichus, ritual action, not mere contemplation, affects union with the divine. Dionysius Christianizes this. The sacraments, Eucharist and baptism, are theurgy. They are divine works that purify, illuminate, and perfect the soul through material symbols. So if you're sitting in Athens in 500 as a Christian and you want to attract as many followers of Neoplatonism as you can, this is what you're going to do. This is how you're going to express it. You could, if you really wanted to extend the best benefit of the doubt, you could see this as a Christian tract to Neoplatonists from a Christian who understands Neoplatonist thought and is trying to use it. And we see people do this all the time. It's almost like the crazy churches that do Star Wars themed stuff, Use the culture, use what's popular, bring them in, whatever it takes, Is that what's going on? I don't know, but you give them credit for trying. In the divine names, it's not a philosophical treatise on divine attributes in the abstract, but an expression of the names Scripture itself uses for God. Dionysius asks, what may we say of the God who is beyond all speech? So, here's a quote. The good is not ineffable, as if it were some kind of thing that may be spoken of. Indeed, we maintain that it is celebrated by many names, yet since it is the cause of all things, we celebrate it with the names of everything it causes. You might have to think about that more than once. It's there on the screen. It actually does make some sense. So the names of God, Agathos, On, Zoe, Sophia, Dunamis, Kalos, Eros, Agape. All of these are names of God. Perfection, one, hen, all drawn from Scripture, explained as modes of divine self-giving. Cataphatic theology, affirmative theology, we may say what God causes and gives. light, life, and goodness. These statements are true, but always partial, always falling short of the divine reality they point toward. Now, is there truth in that? Well, yeah. Human language, even when used by God to communicate to us, is not exhaustive of the divine reality. That's true. Where apophatic theology becomes imbalanced is when you then do not realize that God chose to create in such a fashion that that would be the reality, and that he chose to cataphatically, positively reveal the truth about his own existence and nature. And that he holds us accountable for the positive element, not the negative element. So that's where massive imbalances have developed over the years. The priority of the good, the divine names opens and closes around the good as the supreme divine name, the source of all procession, desired by all creation. Thomas Aquinas noted that the DN itself traces procession beginning with good and return ending with the one. So that was important in Thomas's development of theology as well. The celestial hierarchy. Hierarchy is a sacred order, a state of understanding, and an activity approximating as closely as possible to the divine, with the help of God being raised up to imitation of him. So the big thing here is this gets into a lot of angelology, which there are still people that really get into a lot of this stuff, but they frequently end up on TBN, so I don't spend a lot of time with them. But you have three triads of threes. So the first triad is the seraphim, the cherubim, and the thrones. Closest to God receive the divine light directly. The second triad, dominions, virtues, and powers. They mediate the order, the hierarchical illumination downward. They mediate and order the hierarchical illumination downward. So remember, hierarchy, certain things only go one direction, certain other things only go the other direction. And so divine light goes to the seraphim, the cherubim, and the thrones. From them, the dominions, virtues, and powers mediate and order the hierarchical illumination downward. And then the third triad, principalities, archangels, and angels. They are the nearest to humanity, directly minister to the earthly realm, but of course they are only receiving what has come to them from above them in the hierarchy. Now, there's lots of discussion of this stuff in the early church. Clement of Alexandria, Origen have extensive discussions of angelology and powers and things like that. It's not like this just popped up out of no place. But there's a very specific organization here. Then the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The earthly church, as an icon of the celestial. Each liturgical rite is a theurgical act, working divine transformation through material symbols on those who participate. So sacramental rites are interpreted here. So baptism, birth into the divine light, purification from darkness. Eucharist, the synaxis, the gathering into unity, communion with God. Chrismation, the gift of the Spirit, sealing of the initiate. This is particularly central in Eastern Orthodox theology, more so than in Western theology. The monastic rite, the consecration to the life of the angels. Ordination, conferral of hierarchical functions. See, hierarchy is absolutely central. Funeral rite, the soul's return to its source. There are three hierarchical orders. You've got the clergy, the bishop, priest, deacon, the initiators, those who perform and communicate the sacred rites. You have the initiated, the monks, holy people, catechumens, those being purified, illumined, and perfected. And you have the three movements. You have purification, catharsis, to illumination, photismos, to perfection, teleiosis, the universal pattern of hierarchical ascent. And again, this has all had great impact on the development of Eastern Orthodox theology. In the mystical theology, the shortest treatise, which I read to you on the last trip, 5 brief chapters, yet the crown of the entire corpus. It marks the point where all language, all theology, all knowing falls into silence before a God who exceeds every affirmation and every negation. So, Mystical Theology 1:1. Remember, this is how it started. Trinity, higher than any being, any divinity, any goodness, guide of Christians in the wisdom of heaven. Lead us up beyond unknowing and light to the farthest, highest peak of mystic scripture, where the mysteries of God's word lie simple, absolute, and unchangeable in the brilliant darkness of a hidden silence. You see the apophatic nature of this. So every affirmation about God is transcended by a corresponding negation, not as a contradiction, and that's how we hear it. Western thinkers just don't think this way. It's one of the reasons I've said I've wanted to avoid Eastern Orthodoxy. We just don't think this way. That's not, from Dionysius' perspective, a contradiction, but as acknowledgement that God exceeds all categories. God is not being, God is beyond being. Hyperousios. Moses on Sinai, the paradigmatic image. Moses enters the cloud of unknowing, Exodus 20:21, the divine darkness that is not darkness but excess of light. The soul's ascent culminates not in knowledge but in union beyond knowing. And the brilliant darkness, the paradox at the heart of Dionysian mysticism, the higher the soul ascends, the more language fails, until union is achieved in silence. This language shapes the entire Western mystical tradition. I've mentioned especially Meister Eckhart. I think my church history professor had something for Meister Eckhart because he talked a lot about him. But you will find this concept of union with God all through Eastern and Western mysticism. And this is where it came from. The 4 major treatises are not independent essays, they form a single movement. The divine descends into scriptural and liturgical symbols, procession, in order to uplift the faithful back to their divine source, the return. All interpretation, all theurgy serves this one end. So, theological representations, God's oneness and Trinitarian distinctions, the divine names, intelligible, bodiless names for God, symbolic theology, perceptible anthropomorphic symbols, celestial hierarchy, angels and scriptural symbols, ecclesiastical hierarchy, church rites, and liturgical symbols. The pivot is review of procession, launch of return into silence. Back and forth it goes in each generation. So cataphatic theology, affirmative theology, says that what God is based on Scripture's own language, so the names of God. These names are true, they reflect real participation in God's self-giving, but they are always inadequate, always pointing beyond themselves to a reality that exceeds all language. The cause of all things is none of these things. Apophatic theology, negative theology, denying of God every category that belongs to creation. God is not body, not shape, not quality, not quantity, not place, not time, not knowledge, not truth, not light, not being. The negations are not mere corrections of the affirmations. They are a higher movement of the soul, ascending by the way of unknowing. You see the Greek term there, agnosia, from which we get agnostic. By the way of unknowing toward union with God who transcends all knowing. The cause of all is above all. Mystical Theology 5. The 10 letters, I'll just be real brief here because we're running out of time and I have limitation here. Got to go pick something up before our store closes. You have epistles to Gaius, a monk, on apophatic theology, Dorotheus, a deacon, Sosipater, a priest, Polycarp, a bishop, that is the Polycarp. And that there is a reference there to the eclipse at the crucifixion, which is really, really interesting. Demophilus, a monk, Titus, a bishop, symbolic theology, what the Bible means by giving God bodily form, summary of the symbolic theology. And finally, to an apostle, John at Patmos, brief letter of consolation to the exiled apostle, the apex, the ascending sequence. But you'll see the ascension because Gaius is being rebuked, so that's at the lower end. Very, very interesting.
Where we're going to pick up, and that's with the problem of anachronism. And so, anachronism, of course, is a term that we have discussed many times before in the sense of talking about how Western individuals lived with the idea of anachronism. We've talked about how you'll see the paintings from the medieval period of David, and he's riding a horse and he's wearing armor and he's got a castle and stuff like that. And David wouldn't have had those types of things, but they thought that he did because of anachronism. Many of the people lived in that time period, never moved more than 7 miles any one direction from where they were born. And so they felt that things had always been the same. And in light of that, it took time for people like Lorenzo Valla and others to start recognizing anachronisms. So they recognized that the donation of Constantine, which had been so important in the establishment of papal authority, made reference to stuff that was supposed to exist in the days of Constantine, but it didn't exist in the days of Constantine, so this had to have been written later. That's how you recognize historical frauds. And historical frauds had a huge part in the development, of ecclesiastical theology and churches. The papacy, as we'll see, Pseudo-Dionysius, if it is taken as a first century document, as it was starting in like 530, as if this was actually written by Dionysius the Areopagite in the first century, it created all sorts of anachronism. But that only gets recognized at a later point, when we recognize the development of things over time. And so, the problem of anachronism, what happens when the corpus is read as genuine first century material? The anachronisms are severe, cumulative, and fatal to the claim. Now, two things. I'm not presenting my paper yet. I have a presentation. I just gave my paper to an AI and said, make a PowerPoint. That's easy to do. But I'm not presenting that yet. There's going to be a discussion down here that's going to mention part of this, but I'll have to put some of that off to a later point. But we are dealing with a situation today where there is a theory that has been floated over the past couple of years by Nicotopoulos and Trulia, who I will be debating Mr. Trulia in October, that is trying to rehabilitate sort of the long-term view of Dionysius as actually being first century, rather than the scholarly consensus, and this is a consensus, honestly, and they admit this, amongst all historians, almost all historians. The only exceptions might be some Eastern Orthodox guys. But Roman Catholic scholarship, the Roman Catholic Academy, Protestant, unbelieving, whatever, all view the Dionysian corpus, the books that we talked about, and again, I can't go back and do that, we did that in the last program, as having been written around the year 500. So, half a millennium after the birth of Christ. So you've got to factor that in to, is this, if you think these books were written by a convert of Paul, that's going to have a huge impact on the authority. But if you believe they're written by someone pretending to be the convert of Paul half a millennium later, obviously that impacts their authority as well in a very, very different way. So, liturgical, theological vocabulary, Neoplatonic framework, ecclesiastical structure, and the silence of the fathers. So what is this referring to? All right. The EH, the Ecclesiastical Hierarchy, remember, If you just watch this program right after watching Saturday's program, it will flow. If you skip everything I just did about Dan McClellan, it'll flow. The Ecclesiastical Hierarchy describes a developed liturgical order. The Eucharistic rite with its specific sequence of readings, dismissals, and reserved roles for clergy and laity that matches the 5th, 6th century Byzantine liturgy, not the simple meal gatherings of the Pauline churches. The Myron Chrismation rite described presupposes centuries of liturgical development. So this is this is what almost everyone in the academy believes. That's not an argument for me. I'm just simply letting you know that Roman Catholics would agree with what is being said here. That Roman Catholic scholarship would agree with what is being said here. The description of the ecclesiastical offices, worship found in the Dionysian corpus developed over time. It was not present in the 1st century. It was not present in the 2nd century. Many elements of it did not develop until the 3rd. And so if you accept the Nicotopolis Trillia theory, that this is 1st century, then you have to explain, then why did everybody else forget this? Why does Ignatius not know this? Why does the Didache not know this? Because this puts, Dionysius becomes earlier than anything else. It is the earliest document outside the New Testament. It's before the Didache. It's before any of the Apostolic Fathers. It's before Ignatius' letters. Long before Justin. Long before Irenaeus. They don't know this stuff. The specifics of these types of things, the Eucharistic rite with a specific sequence of readings, dismissals, reserved roles for clergy and laity, 5th, 6th century Byzantine religion. That's the Byzantine Empire 500 years down the road, not the 1st century. Where did all that knowledge go? Did the books just disappear, only to reemerge later? But if this was the apostolic teaching, then no one repeated the apostolic teaching except Dionysius, who then no one ever quotes? That's a real problem. That's a real problem. Theological vocabulary. The corpus uses fully developed Trinitarian and Christological terminology, hypostasis, phusis, theandrikos, that emerged from the councils of Nicaea, Constantinople, and Chalcedon, and of course all the controversies that preceded, happened during, and after said councils. None of this vocabulary existed in Paul's day. And as we look at, that's one of the things you look at, that one section in Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians, God in man, and you go, look at that. Well, if that's coming after Dionysius, it's not nearly as important. In fact, it's not quite as clear as Dionysius. Because Dionysius gives us fully developed Trinitarian language from the 5th and 6th century as if it actually occurred in the 1st century. Which, again, people go, well, that would be great, that would be wonderful. Only if it's true. It's only wonderful if it's true. I mean, you've got to be able to take this stuff into debate with Muslims and others. You can't just throw it out there and say, we're going to believe it. And honestly, fundamentally, when you boil everything down, one of my assertions is going to be that the men who believe that theory believe it because the Eastern Orthodox Church, they believe, tells them to believe it. They actually make reference to ecumenical councils, Nicaea too, and Orthodox saints. So Orthodox saints believed it, and they did. So that's what makes it true. Well, you can't take that into a debate with a Muslim. So there you go. Neoplatonic framework. The corpus systematically employs the technical vocabulary of Proclus and Iamblichus, procession, reversion, henosis, theurgy, the triadic structure, remaining, procession, return. Again, stuff that we talked about on Saturday in the hierarchy and hierarchical directions, remaining, procession, return. Certain things go one direction, other things only go the other direction. Concepts formalized in the 3rd through 5th centuries AD, but that did not exist in the 1st century, and certainly are not to be found anywhere in Paul. I mean, where does Dionysius get this? I mean, wouldn't Dionysius' actual value be as a transmitter of apostolic teaching from Paul, the one who taught him? So, if Dionysius is giving us all sorts of stuff that Paul never dreamed of, what does that tell us? And of course, recognize something else. If you accept this, as people like Thomas Aquinas did, what's the temptation? The temptation is now to take Dionysius and make that the lens through which you do what? You read Paul. You see? So, let me give you just a wild example here for those of you who are apologetically minded. When we read Joseph Smith's final sermons, King Philip Discourse, Sermon in the Grove, the natural tendency is for us to read them through the lens of what? The Utah Church, the people that were there, the Journal of Discourses, the developing theology in the next few decades from the people who were actually there and heard it in the first place. You see? So what's happening today? There are people saying, oh, no. We don't need to worry about all that rest of that stuff. They missed the boat, and we can go another direction. But the natural tendency is, well, you're going to read it in light of that. So Dionysius would function like the Journal of Discourses for Joseph Smith. Naturally. And that ends up impacting how people interpret the New Testament when you have this lens that they're looking through. Now, we don't have that lens as non-Roman Catholics and non-Eastern Orthodox. And that would explain why we come to very different conclusions when we look at New Testament language. Now, how many Roman Catholics recognize that they have that lens? How many of my dear brothers who are so excited about Thomas Aquinas, and he's just so wonderful, and we have people drawing pictures, and we're selling books in the bookstore, and all that kind of stuff. Well, I'm going to tell you about that in a second. I'm getting ahead. I'm thinking ahead of myself. So just hold on a second on that. Okay. Ecclesiastical structure. The 3-tier clergy, bishop, priest, deacon, appears as an established ancient institution with complex ordination rites, not the fluid charismatic ministry in the New Testament period. The monastic order is treated as a recognized hierarchical rank, post-dating Anthony, who died in 356, and Pachomius, if you're familiar with, well, there wouldn't be a reason for you to be familiar with it, but historically speaking, Anthony, so in the middle of the 4th century, Pachomius, these are huge names in the development and establishment of the monastic orders and the rise of monasticism. Monks, you've got the Desert Fathers in Egypt. But again, all that gets thrown out. All that gets becomes irrelevant. Because all they were doing was reestablishing what had been established by Paul via Dionysius in the 1st century. Again, I do not believe there is a single Roman Catholic scholar anywhere who teaches that these offices existed in the 1st century in the way they're seen in the Dionysian corpus. I just don't think there are. And I think there would be many Eastern Orthodox scholars who likewise would not view it that way. As far as I know, the only people who are willing to put up with this level of anachronism are people in Eastern Orthodoxy that believe this is a 1st century document. But yeah, bishop, priest, deacon, the distinction's already made. Even the argument that Mitch Packwood presented against me in our debate on the priesthood a couple decades ago now, would be falsified by the acceptance of the Pseudo-Dionysian corpus as being a first century production. Now, his argument was this was, again, development over time, where presbyter, presbyteros, and episkopos become distinguished, even though in the New Testament they're not distinguished, they are the same office. They become distinguished, and the one becomes the priesthood. If Pseudo-Dionysius is actually Dionysius, first century, none of that's true. It is an apostolic origination of those differences, which then makes Paul contradictory to Paul. Paul needed to read Dionysius. Paul needed to get caught up on all the new stuff. Finally, Silence of the Fathers, which is the fundamental thesis of my paper. No father before the late 4th century cites or knows the corpus. Ignatius of Antioch, 107, if that's the date. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus. Justin is in the middle of the 2nd century, around 150s. Irenaeus, end of the 2nd century. Clement of Alexandria, Origen, all are silent. Eusebius, the great cataloger of Christian literature, died in 339, does not mention it. This is inexplicable if the work dates to Paul's convert. That is going to be something that I will expand upon greatly, and I've spent months expanding upon greatly through primarily utilization of the Thesaurus Lingua Graeci ancient Greek database and the searches that I've spent many, many hours on with that. But one of the, I'll tell you, one of the portions of the paper is the Eusebian silence. Eusebius, the first real church historian, shall we say, who documents, well, the fascinating thing is Eusebius documents all sorts of writings that we know nothing about. He's the only one who mentions it. We have no fragments. We got nothing. This guy was the quintessential hyper-focused librarian. Okay? You know that guy? But this is before the internet, folks. You know what I mean? I mean, this is, I cannot imagine the amount of energy he put into detail and attention. Amazing, amazing fellow. And he makes reference to all sorts of things. And, you know, in the modern period, we'll even say, you know, he put too much trust in this or too much trust in that, or he was a little bit too, you know, this, that, or the other thing. We criticize some of the things that he said, but the point is, he names his sources. And if there was a corpus of material the size of Justin Martyr's writings, and during my research, I was using AI to go, how big was this? When did this first get published? Where? Something like that. So I have it go off and do its thing while I'm doing searches in Theology and stuff like that. And the funny thing was, I very often caught AI. I was using Claude primarily. I very often caught Claude. And I was going, you know, it seems to me that the size of the Pseudo-Dionysian corpus is very similar to Justin Martyr. And at first, Claude was like, no, doesn't look like it. I'm looking at how many column inches it takes in means and stuff like that. And I would say, no. I'm like, you know what? I can find out. I happened to have access to a means on my own computer to do a word count for Justin in Greek. And I had just, the ministry, thanks to y'all's support, had just purchased for me the current critical edition of Dionysius. And so I have both of them and can do a word count on both of them in certain programs that I have, and they are within a few percentages of each other. Very, very similar in size. Now, Justin Martyr, writing around the 150s, is being quoted within a few decades by other people. He is known. He is quoted. Eusebius knows him. Eusebius quotes him by name. Dionysius is about 50 years earlier, but he's still even earlier than the earliest dates for Ignatius. He's about the same size. This corpus of books and letters that always circulate together. They never circulate separately. Isn't that interesting? Even the New Testament letters circulated separately before they were collected together. Not the letters of Dionysius. There's a reason for that. They weren't written as letters to real people. They were written as letters to communicate something, and were always together. And so, when you look at Justin, Eusebius knows him, mentions him, he's quoted immediately. Dionysius, more important, earlier, same size, nothing. Nothing. Nobody knows. Nobody ever quotes it. Nobody ever quotes it. So yeah, silence of the fathers, that's a big one. That's a big one. The silence of history and the late emergence. So, 57 AD, Dionysius the Areopagite converted, Acts 17:34. If he wrote the corpus, it would be cited within decades. Now, we don't know when he would have written it. I mean, that's one thing that we do have to sort of think about is how old was he when he was converted? What if he was young and he lived a long time? Could he have written the corpus late in the first century? I suppose. You have to leave that stuff there. There's no data. No one ever claims to have seen this stuff. So 107-ish, Ignatius of Antioch, again, taking the early date, letters full of hierarchical thought, would have treasured this corpus, complete silence. Ignatius knows nothing about it. And you have to explain, how would he have not known something this important? And especially if you try to say, well, Ignatius knew the apostles, well then, doesn't it make logical sense to say that Ignatius would have known of Dionysius, Paul's celebrated Greek philosophical convert at the Areopagus? But nothing about it. It would have fit into his stuff perfectly. Irenaeus, 185, combating Gnostic heresies of eons, hierarchies of eons, sorry. And they have, again, Gnosticism has all sorts of hierarchies. And so if you had a commentary from a convert, an apostolic convert, was converted by one of the apostles, and he has this whole discussion of hierarchies and the direction it goes, and it doesn't do this, but it only does that, and this is coming from the apostles. And so now you're taking on the Gnostic hierarchies. What else would you quote? He knows nothing about it. Not a word. Not a word. The corpus is a perfect resource for Irenaeus. Silence. Nothing there. Nothing there. Eusebius Caesarea, already mentioned this, catalogs every known Christian writing, not one mention of the corpus or its author. Well, I shouldn't say or its author. Well, okay, that makes sense. You could describe that as author from 500. I just don't want you understanding that as saying that he never mentions Dionysius, because he does know Acts 17:34. But in the first 500 years, you know what's known about Dionysius? Acts 17:34. That's all you've got. I mean, you get the tradition of another Dionysius, bishop in Corinth at some point. Was it Corinth? No. Another place. Anyways, but the only establishable connection to apostolic teaching is Acts 17:34. That's all you got. Then you'll notice this, 379, 390, again, wide range dates here, probably 383, but anyway, this is the Trulia Nicotopolis. You see it here at Nicotopolis and Trulia theory. This is what my article responds to. Their argument is that Gregory Nazianzen and Jerome, possible oblique allusions, debated, argued by Nicotopolis and Trulia. This is why I wrote the article, is because once I saw this, I knew that this was the one thing that really needed to be addressed, because to deal with the dating of obscure statements by Gregory Nazianzen and Jerome, you have to have access to certain resources. You have to know how to track this stuff down, and be able to. No, you don't. Just ask Claude. Just ask Grok. Both of them, and Claude more often than Grok, will say, check the original sources. And like I said, during my research, there was more than once that I caught, didn't use Grok, but I caught Claude. And he admitted it. 532, oh my goodness, 532, first undisputed citation, the Council of Constantinople. Monophysites cite Dionysius. Chalcedonians challenge its authenticity immediately. By 536, Sergius of Rashana translates corpus into Syriac. Death of Sergius, corpus fully in circulation, 540 to 550. John of Scythopoulos produces his Scholia and Prologue, the editorial layer that shapes all subsequent Greek transmission. So now, from this point on, from 532 on, Pseudo-Dionysius as a corpus is in full distribution in the East, and is accepted as being the work of Dionysius the Areopagite. Now, the influence of Dionysian corpus. Eastern Church, Maximus the Confessor, 7th century. John of Damascus, 8th century. Gregory Palamas, 14th century. The corpus was immediately central to Byzantine theology and spirituality. Maximus harmonized it with Chalcedonian Christology. Palamas' theology of divine energies builds directly on Dionysian foundations. Maximus the Confessor is, for the East, what Augustine was for the West. And so you would not have Eastern Orthodox theology as it exists today without Maximus. And you would not have Maximus without Dionysius. And Maximus is using Dionysius as apostolic. Do you see how important this is? Do you see the impact that it has? The fact that for 1,000 years in East and West, first in the East, then in the West, especially thanks to Thomas, Dionysius is seen as the convert of the Apostle Paul. You can't have a higher commentary and authority than he provides you. It's just, Eastern Church. Nicaea 2. You see why this is important? What's the thesis for the debate on October 17th? Icon veneration, as defined by the Second Nicene Council in 787, is apostolic. So notice something. The corpus is cited in the Acts of Nicaea 2. Believe me, I know where. In the context of image theology and the proper reverence owed to sacred symbols, a direct application of Dionysian symbolic theology to the iconoclast controversy. And they accept it as being first century. An allegedly infallible ecumenical council utilizing a forgery. Now, it's not the only forgery they used. What are called the horos that they produced in response to Hiera in 754, their Florilegium was filled. So in other words, the citations that they produced to prove their point at the council, filled, well, not filled as if every single one, but numerous references to what we recognize today to be forgeries. Now, of course, I guess you could argue that as long as the council cited it, that makes it true, right? That's a pretty scary way of doing history, but it is a way that can be done. So the corpus is cited in the Acts of Nicaea II in 787. Then John Scotus, Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventura. The corpus gets translated into Latin, finally, because it's in Greek before then, Syriac as well, making it foundational for Western medieval theology. Aquinas wrote a commentary. I should have brought him. It's in the other office, other room. Aquinas wrote a commentary on the divine names. It's just been translated into English. That's the book that someone wrote to you, Rich, and wanted to know where to get it because it just appeared, I think, within the past year. Aquinas wrote a commentary on the divine names. The corpus shapes scholastic discussions of God's nature and the soul's ascent. Western theology, medieval theology, out of which comes the Reformation. And so some of the reformers are having to push back against Dionysius before he's really critically recognized as being non-apostolic. Because they recognize the vast difference between biblical theology and Dionysius' theology. So, Western mysticism, I've mentioned this, Meister Eckhart, John Tauler, the Cloud of Unknowing, John of the Cross. I do not claim to be an expert on mysticism. I had to study this stuff in church history class and in classes beyond that. Obviously, it's fascinating, but so thoroughly separated from biblical foundations that, you know, for someone whose primary passion is apologetics, it's like, But the apophatic tradition of the mystical theology, remember mystical theology, one of the books, shaped the entire trajectory of Western mystical theology. The Via Negativa, the Cloud of Unknowing, the Dark Night of the Soul are all Dionysian inheritance. And so anybody that is familiar with Western mysticism is now going, wow, that is central to how this theology, this experiential theology developed at that time frame. And it's coming from an unknown author in 500 AD. Finally, Lorenzo Valla, Erasmus, Renaissance Critique, Renaissance Humanists first challenged the apostolic authorship on philological grounds. The same Cook-Stiglmaier discovery of linguistic anachronism prefigured 2 centuries earlier. The scholarly modern consensus follows their lead. So Lorenzo Valla, one of the first people to recognize anachronism, Erasmus, they sensed that there was a problem here, and they questioned it. But they didn't have the tools to yet demonstrate and pull all the threads together that we have in the modern period to be able to demonstrate the secondary nature of this material. I realize it's 3 o'clock, but I'm going to finish this. Thomas Aquinas and the Dionysian corpus. This is important. Aquinas cites Dionysius over 1,700 times in the Summa Theologia and more than 1,000 additional times across his other works. No non-biblical author more frequently. He treats Dionysius as carrying authority comparable to Augustine and superior on questions of divine unknowability. I use the number 500 in my paper just simply because there's some dispute about that, so you use the lower number, and if it's the larger number, then that's perfectly fine. But the point is, the only people that Thomas quotes more often, outside of the apostles, of course, is Augustine and Aristotle. Dionysius is third. So, for all of you big fans that, get your tonsure cut once a year, and you have your little, Thomas Aquinas bobblehead doll on your desk, and you're all excited about the Crossway series of books, Thomas Aquinas for Protestants, or in other words, Thomas Aquinas on your way to becoming Dominican. Same series, just the subtitle they're probably using Crossway. That's going to get me in a lot of trouble. So much for getting published there. What do you think? That ended a long time ago. Anyway, you need to recognize that your big guy, his biggest sources of influence is Aristotle, whose God is not the Christian God at all, and Dionysius, who's writing 500 years after Christ, who is primarily Christianizing Neoplatonism. Those are your biggest sources. Now, I can't fault him for not having been critical in a non-critical age, but you do have to recognize Thomas Aquinas quoted all sorts of forged documents. Not because he was trying to deceive anybody, because he didn't know any better. And that influenced all sorts of stuff. It really did. You've just got to deal with it. Aquinas wrote a complete chapter-by-chapter commentary on the divine names, the book I mentioned just before, in 1265-1268, integrating Dionysian apophatic theology with his analogical method. What Dionysius calls super-essential, Aquinas absorbs as the via negativa within the analogia entis, calibrating rather than abandoning theological language about God. Calibrating. Trying to continue to use traditional language, but using a lens to change it, to calibrate it to a deeper sense. Yeah, that's what he's trying to do. That's the terminology. Divine simplicity and incomprehensibility. The threefold way, purgative, illuminative, unitive from Dionysian hierarchical ascent, angelic orders using the celestial hierarchy directly, beauty as a divine transcendental, largely absent in Aristotle, introduced to scholasticism via the divine names, chapter 4, in other words, the Dionysian corpus. That's where it comes from. And it comes through the authority of Thomas Aquinas absorbing this later non-apostolic document that he thought was apostolic. Aquinas accepted Dionysius as a first century apostolic authority, a direct disciple of Paul, and calibrated the weight of his testimony accordingly. This is important. We all do this calibration, okay? We all look at early church sources, and we naturally take anything in the first 100 years as having a primitive weight. That doesn't mean, Justin does not have the completed canon. And so you have to calibrate the weight of his theological assertions against what he didn't have that later generations had. Okay? So we get that. But Dionysius would be earlier than anything else we have. Dionysius would be one step away from being apostolic. It's one step away from being New Testament, though it's really funny. There's never any discussion anywhere about Dionysius ever being in the New Testament. All sorts of other books were thrown out there that were written much later. That's because nobody had ever heard of it before. That's why. Okay. And calibrated the weight of his testimony accordingly. The post-Renaissance scholarly consensus confirmed by Cook and Stegelmeier undermines that basis. That's what we're talking about today. Almost no one believes that he wrote in the first century. The corpus is a 5th century pseudepigraphon. Remember the pseudepigraphon? It's a fancy way of saying forgery. But forgery almost always for us is meant to be a lie to try to deceive someone. There were a lot of books that were written as a pseudepigraphon that people wrote knowing that people would know that wasn't written by that person. Okay? That was a form of literary expression in the ancient world. But it's a 5th century pseudepigraphon, not an apostolic witness. Aquinas' theology is not invalidated, but the epistemological authority he assigned it rested on a mistaken identity, and we should very seriously recognize how much of Aquinas' theology was influenced by forged documents. That's exceptionally important as well. So, there you go. I mean, nobody is sitting out in the audience going right now, wow, I am so excited. I am so glad I tuned in the dividing line today. I can't wait for Sunday when I can share this with my small group at church. All the rest of that kind of stuff. But this is important material. I've already talked to people. Rich knows someone, has talked to someone more than I have about this, but someone that's been associated with the ministry for a long time, and they have family members. Eastern Orthodoxy has become the issue there. And that's becoming more of an issue for a lot of other people. And, I remember way back in the day when we started responding to Roman Catholicism, Michael Fallon will tell you, he stumbled on us because the only information that he could find as a fresh convert out of Roman Catholicism to respond to the Jesuits that were coming after him was Dave Hunt's stuff, which doesn't hold up to Jesuits very well. And all of a sudden, ran into us. But we had to have been there before then to produce that information for it to then be useful to him. And that's what we're trying to do now in this context, is to be useful to everybody else in the same way.